It took 60 years to get this story together when I started. Gilberto Guillemard's family and everything were connected to Marie Laveau and Henrietta DeLille. In the chart, this is the most important thing here. This is how I proved it. There's a census of 1850. He had a small family. He had a wife and he had a son, Arnaldo. Arnaldo had no children, and he got married and began into the DeVilles.
Don Sharp, June 4th, 2025.
Good morning. We're here over at my daughter's house, and we have another video interview for you. This one is special. For many years, there was a missing hidden history in New Orleans. And historians couldn't solve the problem. The hidden history was about a man called Gilberto Guillemard. And he's very important to New Orleans and Louisiana history because he designed and built the three buildings in the plaza, which is now Jackson Square, and 1 million tourists come to see every year. Also, they got a project up now to fix repairs to the cemetery, and that's going to get a lot of publicity. But they knew that the history that we have now is that he left New Orleans in 1805. He left with the intendant Juan Ventura Morales. What ended the Spanish regime in New Orleans was the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. But now they didn't know what happened to Gilberto Guillemard, the building of the three buildings, and all the history of it is in this book, volume 29, in my guidebook for this interview, and a big solution for the history of New Orleans and what happened to the man who built these buildings. All they know is that he left in 1805 with the intendant Juan Ventura Morales. Governor Claiborne threw him out because Morales didn't want to leave. He was next to the governor, the highest official in Spanish New Orleans. But he was selling land across the lake that still belonged to the Spanish, and he was making fortunes. Selling thousands of acres to merchants and speculators. After 2 years of that, Governor Claiborne told him to get out. Gilberto Guillemard stayed because he was broke. He performed his job. He built after the great fires of 1788 and 94. He's the one with Andres Alamaster's financing, started to build the buildings again, the Cabildo and the St. Louis Cathedral. He was working on the third building in 1797 in December, when he was told by his boss, Alamaster, to go with Morgan Edwards. Morgan Edwards had another name. He really wasn't Morgan Edwards. And this is a real big story that could be used in the celebration next year of the 250th anniversary of our country. The Congress passed legislation. They wanted to know any of the 17 states that there's history that is not known. But this is so big that I didn't want to take the time out. I wanted to get Gilberto Guillemard's story out of the way and out to the public to share it with you. But a man called Morgan Edwards Hewitt was having land problems with a man called Jacob Miller who came in. Jacob Miller was interested in another family, Jeffrey Collins, and he married the widow later on. But he went to Carondelet and he said, I want to get a land grant, Spanish land grant on Bayou Castan across the lake. Carondelet was impetuous and he tried to check, but there was nothing in writing. Spanish law of issuing land grants was a lot different from the British. You didn't really have to have a survey until later. And a lot of times people who didn't have the money never had, or it was too difficult, never had the survey. But Carondelet issued a 640-acre land grant that was abandoned by the British before during the War of American Revolution, and they gave it to Jacob Miller, but it already belonged to Morgan Edwards Hewitt, and that's the big story in it. Anyway, so Gilberto Guillemard, who had 2 floors of the presbytere finished, gets on the boat. Morgan Edwards Hewitt went over and got him and brought him back. And he made this beautiful, beautiful survey. When I found out I was still doing the research on my family, the Sharps, I came across an article about the Library of Congress has a map by a surveyor called Gilberto Guillemard. This is the history starting of Mandeville, and it's in a big, I don't want to take this out, a big map I have there. Anyway, Morgan Edwards Hewitt brings Gilberto Guillemard over here, and this is where I come in. And Guillemard makes the survey because the Sharps were already up here, George Sharp, and I was interested in on who was the neighbors. So this started my interest in Gilberto Guillemard. He spent 3 weeks making this map, and then he went back to New Orleans. But a sad thing happened. Bad things were starting to happen to Gilberto Guillemard. In 1794, his uncle, Gilbert Antoine St. Maxim, died. They worked together in a service together, fought in the war together and everything. They built, the last thing they built was Fort St. Philip down below New Orleans, and right after they finished, his uncle died. But he was working now with Alamaster on these 3 buildings. He finished the Cabildo, he finished the St. Louis Cathedral, and he was working in 1798 on the Presbyterian. So anyway, but what happened was, after he finished the survey, Morgan Edwards dies. Well, first, Alamaster dies in 1790, in April, I believe, and then Morgan Edwards dies. The widow of Alamaster said, look, I'm not putting any more money in these 3 buildings. I had enough, and I'm stopping. It went to the King of Spain, and he forgave her and everything and agreed with her a year later, too. But anyway, that was, Alamaster never completely paid Gilberto Guillemard. And a letter after the Louisiana Purchase, and Guillemard stayed around trying to collect his money. He couldn't get it from the widow. The Cabildo said they would do, but they never came up with it. One Spanish governor wrote to another Spanish governor saying, Gilberto Guillemard's broke. He hasn't been paid in a year and a half. Guillemard still did a few things. He made a survey of the bottom of the Mississippi River, the outlet and everything. But he was desperate for a job. The American, the French, the Louisiana Purchase killed everything in New Orleans. It took the Spanish authority away from New Orleans and gave it to America. So he's a lieutenant colonel in the military and a surveyor for New Orleans. He was out of a job. He applied trying to get a job all over. He even applied to become the intendant or the governor of Texas, where the Spanish were, in San Antonio, way over there. But they turned him down. In 1804, his son, Arnaldo, his only son. Oh, by the way, he was married, by the way, Gilberto married a woman by the name of Maria Felice Boisdore. I don't know how you pronounce it. Her father was a surgeon in New Orleans. They were married in 1787. Arnaldo was born right after they were married in 1787. Gilberto Guillemard used his influence and his uncle's influence to get his young son into the Spanish military. They started at 12 and so forth like that. In 1804, even though Gilberto Guillemard was in New Orleans trying to get his money, his son got into the Spanish military in the Spanish colony north of the lake of the Florida parish. Pensacola was the capital. There were still 300 troops and a dozen officers there. But he started in young, as 17 years, as an ensign. In 1804, he bought a lot in Pensacola. His father was still in New Orleans trying to get money. But he bought a lot in Pensacola, and next to him was the captain of his military named Marcos Villeray, who plays a very important part. Villeray bought a lot next to him, and he had a daughter called Marie Joseph Villeray. Anyway, and so in 1804, his son Arnaldo was in Pensacola, and he was still in New Orleans. Galvez, the governor, Claiborne, told them to get out. So they left. How do I know where did he go? Well, I showed you in the newspaper. Believe it or not, I read it in the newspaper. It was in the Washington Advertiser, listening to people who were in New Orleans, Spanish people who were leaving and where they were going. It said that Gilberto Guillemard, the designer, the builder, the geographer and so forth, was going to Pensacola. His son was over there. His only son. That's all he had with this woman that he married, the Boisdore. So he leaves and he goes to Pensacola. He was there looking for a job, but one of his friends, a surveyor from New Orleans, Sebastian Pintado, was elected the Surveyor General of the Spanish West Florida. He got the job in October of 1805, right before Gilberto left. Gilberto missed it, but I think Pintado was a favorite of Cronolette, and he got help that way. Anyway, when Gilberto Guillemard gets over there, Pintado helps him out. He gives him a couple of surveying jobs, and Pintado had an order from Spain to remap. First of all, the king has designated a cemetery for Spanish West Florida. It's going to be named St. Michael's. But the graves are spread out all over. He wants them to resurvey the boundaries and to get the cemetery in order. Pintado turns and gets help from Gilberto, gives him a job. The Pintado, his map and survey is called the Pintado Plan. When Gilberto Guillemard went to Pensacola, he didn't realize one thing about Spanish West Florida. It was the worst, the most unhealthy place in our Gulf Coast or even America. Yellow fever. Yellow fever was constantly breaking out in epidemics. Why? Because of Pensacola and St. Augustine being so close to Cuba. The ships would come in from Havana, and in their water cask was the algae of this Aedes mosquito that spread yellow fever. And it killed a lot of the British. But anyway, Gilberto didn't realize where he was going to. Sadly to say, I'm telling you, the building of the Cabildo, the St. Louis Cathedral and the Presbytery, died 2 years and 3 months and 11 months after he left New Orleans. It doesn't say yellow fever, but he died November the 28th, and the Sacramentalists in New Orleans said he died on the 28th and he was buried on the 29th. The only place he could be buried was the brand new cemetery that he just got through surveying. And his friend Pintado took him the burial and placed him in a grave site in the center of the town near the plaza where he had a house. So yellow fever played an important part on what we wanted to know what happened to him. He died in less than 3 years. Now we get into the story about his family, his life, the last years of his day in Pensacola. His wife had a mother-in-law and a father. Her father died in 1788. He was a surgeon in New Orleans called Louis Bisador. He played a very important part in the American Revolution. When the war started, the Spanish didn't know what side the Indians were going to go on, and they were in between. They loved the British products. But anyway, Louis Bisador undertook the job of going to the Choctaw villages and talking to dozens of chiefs and 500 braves. He talked them out of siding with the British and to stay neutral. And for that, it was a dangerous trip, but he played a very important part. He died. For that, the war was over, 1781. In 1783, he goes to the governor, the temporary governor, Estevan Miro. He says, I want a land grant, a big land grant. And from the Bay St. Louis to the Pearl River. Roughly that was 100 to 400,000 acres. He said, I want to start a vestry, raising cattle with using some of my help on that. The Spanish, and he said it's useless land, it's near an Indian village, and there's a lot of swamp around there. Miro said, I see your point, I agree with it. And I order our Surveyor General, Charles Laveau Trudeau, to make a survey. But it was too much of old Trudeau. And going through those swamps in May and the summer with the mosquitoes, you couldn't do it, and especially a large piece of ground like that. So nothing was ever surveyed. But anyway, he died in 1788. Gilberto Guillemard goes to Pensacola. He's broke. His wife's mother-in-law says, look, we have a land grant, a big land grant over there, 100,000 plus acres. Get a survey done. He writes, so in the Supreme Court case record, it states that in 1808 in April, Gilberto Guillemard writes this letter to the intendant Morales to get the surveyor to survey the land. Morales, and that proves that Gilberto Guillemard actually was living over, and he died a few months later after 6 or 7 months later after he wrote the letter. But that's in the Supreme Court record. That's proof that he was living there. The proof that he died on November the 28th is in the Sacramento record of New Orleans. So here we have him established. But getting back to the big land grant, Pintado says, not me, boy, it was me. Nobody would go over there. It was a tremendous job to go through those swamps of mosquitoes. He says, I'll pass it on to Jacques Lorraine in Madisonville, my assistant surveyor on the North Shore. Jacques Lorraine gets the letter, and he writes, this is all in the Supreme Court record. He writes back, brother, he says, I can't do it in May, not with the heat and the mosquitoes, but I can do it in December. So that's the way it stood. But what happened in December? The West Florida Revolt took place, and that canceled out everything. It became the Lone Star State and so forth. So here, the widow of Louis Beisador writes to her daughter saying, look, if you can get Gilberto to get that survey done, we'll have a big, huge, we could sell land. So he writes it. But like I said, the West Florida Rebellion, and Gilberto died. His son becomes a lieutenant. And there's a story that his son has a fallout with General Jackson later on. But anyway, and then the Pintado plan, it starts in 1812 and it was accepted in 1813. Vincent Pintado buried his friend in the central Pensacola and the cemetery, and he named a street and a square for it. That's how Guillemard got that. Pensacola didn't know anything about that, and I don't want to. It was difficult. When you're doing research, a lot of things go into it that makes it successful. Your contacts, how long is the interest. With this, technology was changing. One of my biggest help was the computer, getting help through the computer. But anyway, so that's what happened to Gilberto Guillemard. Now, what happened to his family? His wife starts living in the center of Pensacola. But these epidemics keep coming. And there was a census in 1820 stating she was still in Pensacola. But in 1821, in July and August, a huge epidemic started. And they got there's a club that formed, the Genealogy Club, that collected letters throughout the United States of people writing about what happened. Only a few families were left in Pensacola during this epidemic. 18 people died in one day. They had one of the letters stated that there was only one man going around collecting bodies and burying them in the cemetery. This is when Gilberto Guillemard's wife dies. She disappears, and I think one of the Villery that she was buried, they knew where, she knew where her husband was buried, and the Villerys knew where, and Arnold, her son, knew. So Arnold, by the way, had a run-in with General Jackson, him and his boss, the Colonel Marcos Villery, and they were banished from Pensacola. What happened was General Jackson became governor of Pensacola. He was told to get all the information on land grants and everything. And this was back in 1819. Pintado left in 1817 and went to Cuba, and he took all the papers with him. So, but anyway, the governor Calvo in 1819 couldn't help General Jackson with his project of getting all these papers. General Jackson had a temper, a very strong temper. He put the Spanish governor in a dungeon. He imprisoned him. And he ordered Arnaldo Guillemard and his father-in-law wrote a letter to Congress stating that the Spanish governor was treated badly by General Jackson. General Jackson was so irritated, he ordered Marcos Villery, the colonel, and his aide, Lieutenant Gilberto Guillemard, out of the country. But this is when the epidemic was going on. And no sooner did they left and get to Cuba than he hears that his mother died. They immediately resigned their position as officers, and they came back to Pensacola. Jackson found out about it. He was no longer governor, but his friend Walton was governor, and he told him to put him back in jail. Marcos Villery was so old that the governor said, I couldn't do it. I just restricted them to their houses. Anyway, they write a letter to Congress and the president and saying that we're treated unfairly by General Jackson. Secretary of State Martin Van Buren takes it to the president, I think it was Monroe, and he orders the executive order to release him. So here's Arnaldo getting out of under from General Jackson. That was going on. But his mother died. So there's two in the grave now. There's Gilberto's father, Gilberto Guillemard is in there, and his wife's in there. His son Arnaldo married this Villery girl, who's the daughter of Colonel Villery, and they were living next. Anyway, so everything goes along until we have the census of 1850. And in the census of 1850, we find Arnaldo getting older. He was 61. He died in 1858. And his wife, Maria Joseph Villery, but they had two girls with them, the Villery girls. And I think that was the nieces of a younger brother. But anyway, Arnaldo dies. And his wife, Marie Joseph, is the only one that was alive. And she knew Gilberto when he was alive in 1807 and 1808. And they were living next to the son. She was alive when Gilberto died, and she knew where he was buried. She was alive when her husband died, in 1858 when he was buried, and she was also involved with some nieces, raising the nieces. She dies in 1876. This is my speculation. I hate to do it, but because of the stone, and we knew that she died, and the records state that she's buried in that graveyard, that she is the only one that was alive, and that the only one who could have buried her would have been her Villery nieces. And as you see, they had an iron fence, posts and iron fence around, and they put a stone marker, which wasn't before. Nobody did that because at the first grave markers were 1812. There was no history. Nobody kept a record at first. And they were putting wooden crosses. The wooden crosses would deteriorate. So now we have a graveyard in the St. Michael Cemetery where we know where Gilberto's buried, his wife's buried, his son's buried, and his daughter-in-law is buried. And the reason why I'm saying there was more than one grave, why would a iron post and an iron fence be placed around one grave? I think that was the grave of the Guillemards, the Bizadors, and the de Villeries. Gilberto Guillemard's family, the Bizadors, Louis, his wife had a brother called Louis Bizador. Louis had 10 kids. His 8th kid was a daughter, Margarita. And Margarita married a man called Pierre Edward Suby, and he was the first son of the Bahams. Suby is related to Henrietta DeLille through her grandmother, Henrietta Laveau. Henrietta Laveau had 9 kids. One of them was a boy and the rest was the girls. But anyway, she is the contact between the Gilberto Guillemard's wife, the Bizadors, and Henrietta DeLille. The census of 1850, where Arnaldo was living, he was 63. Marie Joseph Villery was his wife, and they had 2 nieces there. The names were Paulina and Victoria Villeneuve. They're the ones that are responsible for that grave, that marker being, there has to be. That was their aunt. There was no more family left because of Gilberto Guillemard had a very small family. He had a wife and 1 son, and the son had no children. So I'm 98% sure we know that he died. He died in Pensacola. We know he died of yellow fever. We know that he only had 1 son, and she had a wife, and the son had no children. But anyway, to me, if you go into the history books now, they say Gilberto Guillemard, the historians put down, oh, he left in 1805 in December. We know that from the newspaper, and we know that from the Sacramento records. But we also, he only lasted less than 3 years after, but it was a sad ending. He never got paid for his salary, and he died in poverty. This is part of New Orleans history, the most important buildings that historians claim in New Orleans history in Jackson Square. 1 million tourists each year come to New Orleans, and they visit Jackson Square in the French Quarter. And yet we did not know what happened to this man who was born in a little town in France, northern France, called Langy. It was a military town. And he came over in 1770. His uncle came before him. And his uncle is the one that helped Gilberto Guillemard get the position. His uncle came over when it was still a French colony. He wanted to, and he was didn't have a job or something. He went over and joined the military. France passed the colony over to the Spanish. He supported the Spanish, but yet the population didn't like the Spanish taking over, and they sort of revolted. But he stayed with the Spanish, and he was granted land grants and also the right to trade with the Indians on the upper Missouri. He became very rich, and he had a military background. During the war, he was in charge of the militia. They helped to free and capture Mobile and Pensacola. His nephew, Gilberto Guillemard, was a lieutenant, and they distinguished themselves in the American Revolution. Gilberto Guillemard after the war, started making military fortifications around Spanish Louisiana. And after the great fires of 1788 and 1794, Andres Alamaster hired Gilberto Guillemard to rebuild these buildings. And he said, "I'll finance you and pay it," he told the Cabildo. But he was only giving money at a little at a time. The sad part was his uncle died in 1794. His benefactor and boss and financier, Andres Alamaster, died right after the survey was made. He came over to the North Shore. Morgan Edwards Hewitt brought him over, and he did his job with that beautiful survey.